Well, good morning and welcome our Christ Baptist Church family and those who are listening in to our devotion and Bible study of the book of Daniel. We've gone through 2 chapters of the book of Daniel, and we're starting to understand this book that really is helping us understand what it is to be in a place of isolation, in a place where you really can't be with God's people, in a place where physically it's just difficult to find like-minded believers. And Daniel was a servant of God who was put in this very situation to do that. And he was a young Jewish boy who was taken away from Jerusalem and taken to Babylon, and 3 years learning a completely new language, completely indoctrinated in their beliefs, but yet he held strong to his faith. And we saw that in chapter 1, where he stuck with his dietary laws and was able to convince the government to be able to honor his God. It was actually beneficial to the king. And secondly, where his life was put to the test, or his faith was put to the test, where his life was on the line, and he interpreted the dream for the king. We saw that is the first instance in the book of Daniel, where we learn about what's going to be happening in the future for all the nations. There's one big nation, the Roman Empire, that eventually dissipated into a bunch of other little empires that's still going on. But in the end, it's not going to matter, because there's going to be a kingdom produced by God that's going to wipe every other kingdom out. And that's what we as believers have to look forward to, is there is a kingdom for us. Well, that takes us to the end of chapter 2, and now we're into a very familiar story in Daniel chapter 3. And this is the one chapter in the book of Daniel where Daniel's not present. It's about his 3 friends that he had, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's their Babylonian names. And these 3 young men had been promoted. They were in the government of Nebuchadnezzar. They were high officials. They were promoted above everybody else. And this chapter is about their faith in their God. And it's about how they could stand absolute and resolute. And they didn't have Daniel there to hold them. They did this on their own. So we're going to take a look here at this and see what it is to have a conviction of a very, very strong faith. And before we do that, I just want to give a little account, a brief story. 1963, I have the note right here. 1963, a young man, his name was Brian Sternberg. In 1963, he held many records in athletics, track and field, and he held records in pole vault. And he was set to go in for the next Olympics. And as he was practicing for his events and finding out what kind of next records he's going to set, he was practicing on the trampoline. And as he did so, he landed on his neck, heard a crack, and lost all feeling below his shoulders. And his faith was tested. See, Ryan was a Christian. He was a very strong Christian. And after 1 year, he was still in a wheelchair, couldn't move anything. And he was interviewed by a magazine at the time called Look Magazine. And he said, "My faith is strong, and it takes strong faith. My faith takes me to one of 2 places. 1, that God would heal me, or 2, that I would have complete peace of mind. Either one is satisfactory for me. Either one satisfies me. I'm either healed or I get peace of mind about it." And so people were amazed at his faith. But what began to happen after about 10 years? Well-meaning Christians and people who said they were believers would come and meet with Brian and talk to him, and they would tell him that God really wanted him to be healed. And if he just had enough faith, God would heal him. And then after 10 years, he wrestled to the point where he believed then that he did not have peace of mind anymore, because he didn't believe in the sovereignty of God and believed that it was God's will for him to be healed. So therefore something is deficient in his faith. Well, he lost it because he lost the understanding of something very important, of God's sovereignty in all decisions, including his ability to walk. And that's why it's so important to get our theology correct. So it's so important to get our understanding of who God is, because so many people look at their condition, they say God must have made a mistake, something bypassed God, or Satan got in the way, and therefore my God needs to do something, but when he doesn't, it's either God is deficient or my faith is deficient. And so I live in great turmoil the rest of my life. Well, we see here 3 men that were going to be put in this situation to the test, and we find that they did not have deficient faith. We find that there's some elements that we can learn from their experience that'll help us as we are in tough situations. So if you're having some difficult situations in your house here, we're under lockdown, but at the same time, maybe it's not lockdown that's concerning you. Maybe it's not a sickness or exposure to a virus that concerns you. Maybe it's some other issues that are going on with your family, your home, your ability to provide, things that are happening in terms of understanding who God is and what you're willing to do. We're all put in these circumstances at times in our times of life. Not all are the same, but we can all have the same response as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, let's take a look here. Daniel chapter 3. It's again a longer chapter of 30 verses, but really it's a simple story. Many of you might know it. It's such a shock to see what happens in the flow of this book. Chapter 1, Daniel gets taken away. He's trained. He convinces his overseer, his boss, that he could eat different foods to just test to see if he's better. He came out better, so it was all to the service of the king. And then chapter 2, the king is terrified because he's starting to lose a grip on his control in his mind. And he had a dream, and God troubled him so much that he wanted to threaten every magician in the country. And Daniel was going to die, but then he said, "Could you just wait, and my God will interpret for you?" And that's what happened, and Daniel gave him that interpretation. So Daniel understood what it was to be at the point of death, as well as these 3 men who also were. But in the very first verse of chapter 3, Daniel's not around, but we see here Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, how big is this statue? Well, if it were a building, it would be 9 stories tall. 9 stories tall. 30 meters. That's the size of this statue. And it would be approximately 3 meters wide. So a statue that's built up to 3 meters wide and 30 meters tall. Why would the king set this up in a plain somewhere? Well, he did have this dream about a statue and a head of gold. And so maybe he was just in his way trying to say, I am that head of gold, and I'm going to be great, and I'm going to be the one. His pride was just way ahead of him. So he set this up. And then verses 2 to 7 tell us that he set some rules in place. That he said, I want everybody to worship this statue, which obviously in Nebuchadnezzar's mind would represent himself. Everybody's going to worship this statue that I'd set up as soon as the music starts playing. So they had this kind of a musical tune that would play, and as soon as the music starts playing, everyone's supposed to bow down. And it was given in verse 4 that says, to you the command is given, O people, nations, and men of every language. So it doesn't matter what language you have. You understand the language of music. That's why they probably did that. Because you can hear music, you can understand music, and you understand the reason for the music is to worship. And if you don't do this, the rule was in verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Well, that's a heck of an alternative. I put up a big statue. Then I just say, when you hear the music, you better bow down. Otherwise, the alternative is we burn everything. We burn you to powder. And so they started, verse 7. And they fired up the music, and everybody falls down because nobody wants to get burned up. That's the situation, right there in an open plain where everybody can see. Well, verse 8 tells us, notice the first 3 words there, for this reason. Interesting, for this reason. At that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. Well, no doubt these Chaldeans could have been, they could have been prominent middle managers in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, but they were bypassed for promotion because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got the good jobs, as well as Daniel. So they're very upset. The same thing we're going to see when we get to Daniel chapter 6. But they immediately turned and they said, aha, we've got you. And they went right to Nebuchadnezzar and told him and said, let me remind you, king, didn't you make a decree that everybody's supposed to worship this statue when the music comes in? And of course the king says, well, of course. They said, whoever does not do that or doesn't fall down and worship will be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And the king said, well, yeah. And then verse 12 tells us, aha, there's certain Jews right there, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon. See, they're pointing it out to the king. See, you appointed these guys who were rebellious, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you and do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you've set up. So we've got you right there. There's the situation. They're just obeying God. They're not worshiping when the music comes. And they were set up by people. And that's the way it is in life sometimes. Because people just really hate what you do, and they might even hate how you worship and what you worship. And so you're set up. And this is what's happened. But to show you that it wasn't just a setup, it wasn't just the Jews, the Chaldeans doing this, verse 13 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar was very upset. So he really was personally invested in this. I mean, he really liked this idol, this statue that he built for himself, because it uses the Bible here uses the words that Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger. He's pretty upset. In rage and anger, gave orders to bring these three men to the king. Now, no doubt the king remembers that they were with Daniel in helping answer the dream about this statue in chapter 2. I mean, it was a big deal. They could actually be used by God to interpret dreams. And so he says, I'm going to give you a chance simply because you have been promoted. You are high. So he just said, look, is it true? I'm going to give you a chance to redeem yourself here. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up? Interesting, he's saying he wants you, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you must serve my gods, even though I learned that it's your God that it can interpret dreams. I learned just a little bit ago that your God is actually the only God who can do things where nobody else can. But now I'm demanding that you worship my gods. So he gives this kind of a challenge in verse 15. Now if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast in the midst of a fire, or furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there that can deliver you out of my hands? I want you to notice two phrases in verse 15. First is, if you are ready, followed by, but if you do not worship. So if you're ready, then okay. But if you do not worship, here's what happens. That's the challenge that's given to these three men. Verses 16 to 18, kind of the center of the story. That's the crux. That's the key to the whole story here, is when these three men listen to the challenge by Nebuchadnezzar. And then they give us their response. And they give us their response about what it is to have a conviction of an unwavering faith. Here's what they say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. So they said this. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. I mean, that's to start off, right off. They said, we don't need to think about it. The answer was done before you asked the question. It tells you how much I don't doubt my faith. Because my faith is in my God. My faith is not in the results of what my God chooses to do. You see, my faith is not in what I think God should do. My faith is not in how I think my God will take care of me. My faith is in who my God is. So we don't need to give you an answer. And here it is in verse 17. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he'll deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Notice in verse 17 and 18, it's just like in verse 15. It starts off with, if it be so, okay, if this situation is not going to change, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But even if he doesn't, there's no chance we're going to worship you or your gods. They replied in exactly the same way that Nebuchadnezzar gave them. He says, if you're ready, okay. But if not, you're not going to worship, then I'm going to burn you. And he said, well, if this is going to be so, our God can deliver us. But if not, there's no chance we're going to worship you or your gods. We don't care about the fire, because our faith is in who our God is. And this is what I want to just point out in this story that we've known so well and so much, that really there's three observations here, looking here, and how they had very, very strong faith. Why they could say to him in verse 16, we don't need to give you an answer. We don't need to think about it. Why? First, what they explained in verse 17 was, we know who our God is. So we know him. And here's who he is. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. He is completely able to do anything and everything he wants to do. He is able to. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. You know what? Either way, we're out of your hand. You back away because he delivers us from the fire, or we get burned up and we're not having to face you anymore. Either way, we're out of your hand. Because in either way, we win. You see, he could deliver us out of the fire, or he could deliver us through the fire and go to him. Either way, it doesn't matter. We know our God. You see, when you know who your God is, it's not about what he does for you, like this young man, Brian Sternberg, who started off that way, but he began to not really know who his God really was, and began to think his God is supposed to do what he wants. These men are facing death. They know it. They're at the end of their rope. They know that. They've got no chance. They know they're guilty. They know they've got no way out. And this can be anybody in life. Well, we're here on this earth. I might not have power to get myself out of or into anything that helps me and my family. God knows that. God knows that. And he stands ready to deliver. Might not be in a way you think, might not be in a way you know, might not be what you want, but he's worth approaching. He is worth submitting to. He is worth clinging to, because he will have the best in mind for his children. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. He brings all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew who God is. Our God is able to deliver. I can describe him to you. He's totally sovereign. But secondly, they submitted to what God does. You see, that's where Brian Sternberg had a problem. Eventually he couldn't submit to what God did. Look at verse 18. Even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image you set up. I submit, meaning I'm not going to fight what God does. If God doesn't deliver me out of the fire, I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to look for a different faith. I'm not going to look for a different result. I will go with him wherever he goes. I'm totally okay with that. You see, God and his will and his plan is worth far more than what's in front of me. And lastly, they do what God commands. You see, they know who God is, they submit to what God does, and they obey what God commands. What do they obey? Let it be known to you, we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image you've set up. We are going to obey what our God says. We are not going to obey you. That's it. And when you are willing to follow that, your faith in God is going to be unshakable. It doesn't mean the storm's going to go away. It doesn't mean the pain is going to be less. It doesn't mean that on this earth, in your situation, that your feelings and your comfort is going to be tried and tested. It doesn't say that. It says that your faith is going to be like on solid rock. And what happened here with these three men, Nebuchadnezzar, we see in verse 19, when they stood up with their faith to the king, is what happens almost always when someone stands with solid rock faith to an adversary who is opposed to God. Nebuchadnezzar's face filled with wrath. He was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward these three men. Interesting, the writer tells us his facial expression was altered. He was filled with rage. So he gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times hotter. I want it to be more painful. I really want it to be where these men know they messed with the wrong king. And it was so much so, they tied up these men. In verse 21, in verse 20, he commanded certain warriors to throw these men into the furnace of blazing fire. So they tied them all up in their clothes, threw them in the midst of the fire. And in verse 22, it says, by then the furnace had grown so hot, 7 times hotter, it actually burned up all the men who threw those 3 men into the fire. The king ended up killing his own men because they made the fire so hot. But as soon as he did that, as soon as they went in there still all tied up, Nebuchadnezzar's looking in there, and he asked the question, verse 24, was it not 3 men we saw bound in the midst of the fire? And they said, yes. And he said, why do I see 4 there? And the 4th is like a son of the gods. He immediately saw their faith realize that they're being delivered right now. He came near in verse 26 to the door of the furnace, and he started talking to them. Can you imagine that? He's talking to the people in the fire. This is the king who said, I want them burned up. And now he goes to the front of the fire where he saw people just killed moments ago. And he says, come here. So they came out of the midst of the fire. And specifically, they came out and everything looked good. They had no effect on the bodies of these men. Nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged or anything. Well, the end of the story is Nebuchadnezzar again was so impressed. But again, he didn't have faith. He was just impressed. He said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, delivered his servants, and put trust in him. They put their trust in him. See, that's what they noticed. He didn't notice that their God just delivered them. He said their God delivered them because they put their trust in him. So he understood it's about their faith. And these servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command. I mean, these people, they trusted their God to violate my command. This is how much he was humbled. He didn't say my command's worth anything anymore. They yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any God except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and houses reduced to rubbish heap, inasmuch as there's no other God who's able to deliver in this way. The king hadn't changed, Anytime someone does something he doesn't like, he wants to kill them and then tear up their houses and make it a rubbish heap. So he has not changed. But he's influenced a lot by, not only by God, but now he's influenced by God, the faith of God's people. He's influenced not by the actions of God, he's influenced by, these men had such faith. Surely God delivered, and he saw that. But these men had faith in God, and that's really what shook him and made him so angry. But again, God's deliverance of how it all worked out. And what was it they did? What was it that caused their faith to be so strong? They knew their God. They submitted to their God and his will and his plan. And they obeyed their God's commands. They didn't even think twice about worshiping other gods. They said, we don't care about our own skin. We want to serve the living God, and he will take care of us. So I want us to think about this as we just close right now. When you're faced with so many things, understand God is worthy, God is good. He's worthy to be worshiped, he's worthy to submit to, and he is good. It doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable today or tomorrow, but he's worthy and he's good, and he works all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose, to those who wait upon the Lord. Waiting upon the Lord, trusting, hoping, and realizing God's word says he cares for us. He knows when a sparrow drops to the ground. He looks after the poor, the widow, the hungry. He does that. He uses providence to care for his people. You can have this faith by knowing all who God is, and not like Brian, who began to forget that God is sovereign. Our God is sovereign, he's able, and he will deliver us. But if he doesn't, I'll submit to him. And because of that, I will obey everything he has told me in his word. And my faith will be unshakable, like that on a rock, like a house built on rock and not sand. Well, that's what we've learned today in Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the one chapter that doesn't star Daniel in the book. See you tomorrow.